Good morning.
Don't I go first?
Yes, if you want to.
So-
Go for it. You
I'm not a lawyer,
didn't
so-
react fast enough.
Yeah. As the complainant, he'll need to be sworn, he's not counsel.
Please raise your right hand. Do you swear affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so
I
help
do.
you God? Thank you.
So in this case, I just want to go through very quickly the affidavit and what actually happened. So Secretary LaRose sent out a campaign material. I have direct personal knowledge of it because I received it. That did not contain a proper disclosure. In my affidavit, I included a copy of the actual material. I included copies of the other materials showing examples of it properly being done, even Secretary LaRose's materials. So I don't, and based on the responses received that the executive director referred to, I don't think there's a lot of question. I do want to point out, though, that I think you guys, some of you know me, so a lot of you are new, is that I'm very into like accountability and people at the highest levels down to the lowest levels, like the woman that has showed up, feeling accountable to our laws, to our election laws, and to our campaign finance laws. The secretary's not here today. Okay, if I was a candidate running in the county, I would have been here today. Okay, not because I necessarily need to be, but because I respect the laws and I want to show that I respect the laws of this state. I just want to point out in this matter that the maximum fine is $500, and I think the chief elections officer in the state should do his campaign literature properly and have a proper review process in place on that campaign literature. I also want to point out that your own rules, 3517-1-04, say that the party shall file a response in the form of an affidavit. In this case, the secretary or his treasurer did not file a response in the form of an affidavit. The affidavits you have are two vendors that are taking responsibility for the mistake. I would have liked to see the secretary, A, be here to show that he, even in a high place, respects that he is under the laws too, and that his behavior is consistent with what he would want and his office would want from other candidates that he brings before this commission. Second, I want you to consider the factor that the secretary did not respond according to your own rules, is that the party, which would mean either him or his treasurer, files a response affidavit to the complaint. The two people that filed response affidavits is a woman who is I guess a consultant or a person that works for someplace named Red Brick Strategies, and a gentleman that works for an outfit called the Dudley Group. I would have liked to see in the responses why there was not proper oversight on these vendors on the part of the secretary's campaign to make sure that printed materials they were sending out, I'm sure at great expense through the mail, were being properly reviewed to be in compliance with the law. So I personally think, I hear the director's recommendation of a $50 fine. And by the way, I think, this whole $50 fine thing is kind of goofy for this commission, because it does depend on the experience of the person who's being brought before this commission. If it's somebody that was running a school board campaign and it's the first time that they struggle to do the campaign finance laws correctly, that's a lot different than the chief elections officer of the state, who should know better and should be an exemplar, not only in following the laws, but taking responsibility when his own campaign didn't have the proper mechanisms in place to review that proper disclaimers were being put on his campaign materials. So I believe that the commission should find, I think they're already admitted that the exhibits, I'll authenticate the exhibits that I got myself in the mail. I don't think they're disputing that. I dispute that the secretary or his treasurer did not file a response affidavit subject to your rules, particularly 3517-1-04A. And I think the fine should be $500. Just as an example, that this commission holds the people that are in the highest rung of supposedly making sure that we have proper campaign finance and proper campaigns in the state accountable. I'm sure that Secretary LaRose can afford $500. Thank you.
Good morning. On behalf of the respondents, Secretary LaRose and LaRose for Ohio, Matt McDonald and Karen McDonald from the law firm of Dickinson Wright at 180 East Broad Street, Columbus, Ohio, 43215. As described in our response, this is a simple case of print vendor error. Mr. Hicks brings this case hoping the mere facial appearance of a violation will harm Secretary LaRose's long-standing stellar reputation for election compliance. Make no mistake, the campaign committee met the letter of Ohio's campaign finance disclosure requirements when drafting this literature piece. There was no violation of Ohio's election laws by the candidate, the committee, or any of its principals. None. LaRose for Ohio is referenced throughout this mail piece. The committee presented a mail piece to its print vendor, the Dudley Group, that included the required conspicuous disclaimer paid for by LaRose for Ohio. That is undisputed and should be dispositive in this case, period. As a factual matter, the committee subsequently instructed its vendor to also include a second disclaimer in an attempt to over-disclose and make explicit that the Secretary's military service does not imply an endorsement from the Army or Department of Defense. As admitted by the Dudley Group, and this is important, the printer made an inadvertent error, despite clear instructions from the committee, in replacing the second disclaimer with the first, instead of adding it as a supplement. That was an honest mistake, and most importantly, not one made by the campaign committee. This is analogous to when a TV or radio station too abruptly cuts a political commercial before a professional voice or written disclaimer appears saying, paid for by. In that circumstance, it would be equally inappropriate to find a committee responsible. In addition, the candidate should be dismissed from this complaint as the statute at issue, Revised Code Section 351720I, specifically only applies to candidate entities, not to candidates themselves. So it applies to campaign entities, candidate committees, not candidates. And ultimately, based on the record, the Commission should at its discretion dismiss this complaint and return its focus to actual election law violations. And just to quickly address the 2 points that Mr. Hicks raised. The party to the case did file a response via its counsel with 2 attachments, which are before you in our response, which is appropriately dated, and in accordance with the rules of this body. In addition, this discussion of fines that was just raised has no statutory basis whatsoever. There is no authority for the Commission to utilize a determination based on an office holder's office that they hold to implicate what the actual fine should be raised. So just to recap this, there should be a finding of no violation because the committee attempted to over-disclose. Mr. Hicks has failed to demonstrate an intentional violation of our campaign finance laws by the Secretary or the committee. The candidate should be dismissed from the complaint as the statute issue applies to campaign entities, not to candidates. The committee followed the law and provided additional disclosure related to the candidate's military service. In particular, the print vendor confirms in his affidavit, I direct you to paragraph 7, that it only substituted the campaign disclosure due to its own error, not the error of the committee or any of its principals. We noted this is analogous to other inadvertent errors, and ultimately the law has been met here. There's no ambiguity about who authored this mail piece. LaRose for Ohio is the clear author of the piece. In fact, the campaign committee's name, LaRose for Ohio, is referenced throughout the piece. It's clear that the checks are intended to be sent to LaRose for Ohio, and that Mr. LaRose and the committee are the author of the document. The complainant has misstated the record and the Secretary's record. The complainant has a record of making exaggerated claims against office holders, and this is one more example of a meritless claim meant to create an appearance of impropriety where there is none. In fact, this is the first time the committee or the candidate have been named as respondents before the OEC, and contrary to the complainant's assertions, neither the committee nor the candidate have been found to have previously violated campaign finance requirements by the Commission. The Commission should not allow itself to be used this way. In closing, the committee has demonstrated an ongoing commitment to follow Ohio's campaign finance laws, and there was no wrongdoing on the part of the committee or the candidate, and the statute only applies to committees, not candidates. We ask the commission find no violation has occurred. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do commissioners have questions? Comments?
Question to the director. The $50 fine relates to, I guess, what framework compared to other violations?
When I make my recommendations on cases such as this, where you essentially have someone, committee, whatever, before the commission for the first time, regardless of their office, to me, this is a case where I would recommend the imposition, or finding no violation, the imposition of a $50 fine. And so I feel like, and what I try to do when I'm making my recommendations is be as consistent as possible, regardless of whether someone's running for township trustee, county commission, governor, secretary of state, and that's, I believe, what I've done here, and so that's the essential basis for my recommendation for the violation in this particular set of circumstances against the parties that are before us, because they're ultimately responsible for the materials that are circulated under their name, under the committee's name.
Well, I mean, my view is I think no one is above or below the law, and we should treat this case absolutely as we would any other. I will say that I find it disappointing that counsel for Secretary LaRose basically accepts no responsibility for the final product going out. We have cases that come across here all the time with inadvertent mistakes. I would have, I guess, been less disappointed if they asked for good cause as opposed to a complete dismissal and lack of responsibility. That being said, again, I think I'm supportive of the current recommendation, but we welcome thoughts from commissioners and the chair.
Just a question for Mr. McDonald, and I've read the affidavit here with Laura Mashutka Prodi, is it? So I think it's clear in here, I just want to make sure. So on the process, they get the piece, and then it doesn't go back to LaRose, they just mail it, is that accurate? Is that what happened? Because they say they mailed the piece. I'm trying to figure the process. If it matters to me if the proof came back to the LaRose campaign, and did they then do their due diligence to say, hey, there's a problem here? Or did it just go to the vendor and the vendor mailed it? That's what I'm trying to figure out. It seems to me, based on this affidavit, that they got the piece and they just mailed it. So can you clear that for us? Or for me, anyway?
Certainly. I think for one thing, the affidavit speaks for itself, so I can't amend,
No, I understand.
I can't amend a sworn written statement of someone, but
Gotcha.
in terms of process, my understanding is that there was communications with the vendor. I'm not sure as to the absolute form and timeline, but my understanding is that the vendor had clear instructions from the committee that they were to include a second disclaimer, and ultimately that direction was not followed.
Can I also respond to the question?
I
So,
mean, it's up to the chair.
one thing I just want to make clear is, I think there's been some representation, since you referenced the affidavit about the piece, like the representation that it had LaRose for Ohio all over it. The only place it has LaRose for Ohio is on the return envelope. No place else that I can see in the piece. So I think there's some issues relating to facts and transparency. And I would remind you, another option you have is that this is a preliminary review. Okay, since I've been personally attacked that I'm somehow, even though currently I think I'm 6-0 on cases before the OEC, that won't hold up, but that I somehow filed frivolous cases when I'm 6-0 in cases that have been fully adjudicated is also a bizarre thing to say. I want to remind the commission, when you think about this or confusion you might have about the affidavit, that another option you have is to hold this over for a full hearing And I would actually recommend that option at this point, given the intransigence, which I'm actually shocked by, of the Secretary's office, of basically saying, we're not responsible. When any candidate, a township trustee, would not be able to walk in here and act like this and say, hey, the printer did, it's not my fault. And it should just be dismissed. And so I just wanted to point out those two things, that there's only one place in the whole piece. Questions as to the affidavit could certainly be cleared up in a full hearing. And I would ask you guys to consider having a full hearing so that the actual facts of this matter can be adjudicated completely, including bringing those affidavit people in to testify as to what actually happened.
So in response to Mr. Hicks's chair, the facts are completely within the affidavits at this time. The issue that is before the commission is whether to find, based on vendor error, whether there should be a violation or not. It would seem as though the time of the commission would be better spent not focusing on further issues which have already been completely described.
Madam Chair, I just want to follow up on Mr. Lyle's question, because I would like to know whether the piece went back to the candidate's campaign for review before it was mailed. That's generally what candidates do, but unless we can hear from the person in the affidavit, we won't know. We won't know what was done from the vendor or from the secretary's campaign.
Madam Chair, yeah, we can speak to that. Our understanding is, yes, the proof came back, and it didn't have military, what we'll call the second disclosure. It had paid for by LaRose. Campaign committee decided we want to add that this does not also indicate endorsement by the military, because Secretary LaRose had a military service that's referenced in the piece. So the review was add that and then send it out. And that's where the error was made, because the vendor who prints also handles shipping, which I think was part of the question. And so, not to be semantical about it, but in terms of what was the final review was, thank you for this, it looks good, add this and send it. And instead of adding it and sending it, it was deleted and replaced the military disclosure, replaced LaRose for Ohio. That's what's described in the affidavit. Mr. McDonald's correct. We think the facts are well known enough to find a decision. We would not support a full hearing on this matter.
Can I respond to the question? So again, I think there's a dispute as to the fact here, as to what actually happened, was it properly viewed. Everything you just said is hearsay, because you're not the counsel for the affidavit filer, and they're not here to be able to say what actually happened, nor is anybody directly from the campaign here to say what actually happened and testify as to what happened.
We represent
And
the campaign.
your counsel for the campaign.
Well,
I also want to point out, this was a 5-page piece, okay, it's not, and normally there's disclaimers all over the place on something like that, because there were multiple physical objects in the envelope that did not, separate pages, separate things, physically in the envelope, none of which had a disclaimer on them, okay? So again, given the intransigence and the dispute as to potential fact as to what actually happened, I think that the other alternative before the commission is to have a full hearing so that I and they can bring these people, the affidavit filers in, and bring in people from the campaign and get answers that clarify what actually happened here. They've chosen to make it an issue by not just saying we screwed up, it's our fault. They're the ones that have made this a point where they want to claim that they have no responsibility. So let's do a full hearing and figure that out.
No response.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions from commissioners? Mr. Richter?
I'm comfortable with my recommendation based on the facts and circumstances that are laid out, in the comments here and the complaint and the response that was submitted. So I'm fine with I believe my recommendation is appropriate for the circumstances.
Hearing from both sides and from Mr. Richter, Do we have a motion?
I'll go ahead with the recommendation of the executive director.
Second.
We have a motion on the floor that's been duly seconded. All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign.
Aye.
Right. Motion carries with a vote of 6 to 1.
Yep.
All right, thank you, gentlemen,
Thank you.
for today.